not ready? Great. The United States federal government should implement an emissions trading system for methane and carbon dioxide in the United States. Advantage 1 is warming emissions plus climatic elements cause disastrous ecological and social consequences. COP and all 16 tipping elements ice sheet collapse water crunches and new lake circulation runaway increasing climate sensitivity collapse the Arctic ice shift in the Amazon release of methane hydrates tipping elements play an important role past climate feedback. The Arctic Sea is a critical special rapid decrease of forestry consequences. Arctic amplification may lead to more frequent weather events. With African monsoon may be another tipping element. The tipping elements are characterized by deep uncertainty. They are absent from a couple climate models. Many community committed changes and largely initially realized tipping elements play an important role in global warming through albedo of greenhouse gas, the regional temperature, precipitation, mean sea level, major ecosystems such as the Amazon. Climate change mitigation adaptation regarding technologies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Society will need low carbon technologies. Technology not tip until there is market formation. Civil conflict variety more costly. Tipping point, warmer temperatures, slow economic growth, increase the likelihood of civil conflict. Crop failure might trigger conflict. Tipping point, extreme weather events, the deployment of large scale climate engineering, large scale economic subsidy with capital drain, disaster, warmer temperatures, also creating economic shocks. These temperature reduced effects on growth rates and carbon pricing can solve these tipping points. Otherwise, catastrophic impacts are inevitable. Shellburner 16 Earth system science provided robust evidence for the safe operating of humanity within the Paris confines. Tipping elements will increase significant impacts on climate change. Of course, we suffer complete deglaciation, the threatening the survival of many nations. Global food supply would be jeopardized. Major ecosystems fortune to extinct. The world would disappear. The world's government therefore best wise to aspire to 1.5 degrees of Paris target. Highly ambitious long lifetime of CO2 implies a strict limited carbon budget in less than 1 degree Celsius. Under the tenable fit without positive concrete calculation. 2 degrees Celsius quadruple would be affected to moderate cost of warming. Would be confined to 1.5 degrees Paris and invites the emission pathway considerably lower into the temperature target. Renewable energy efficiency technology scaled up exponentially. Carbon pricing instruments we adopted more and more nations in the medium term, and adaptation is impossible absent committed mitigation efforts in the short run. Wrong. 16 climate change impacts are irreversible creatures that are unparalleled. If we wait until consequences are obvious, it will be too late. Climate inaction will harm billions. If we contribute to nothing, harm is irreparable. We could avoid harm at a low cost. The impacts are worse in every case. We cut carbon dioxide, CO2, taking CO2 out of the air. We might be able to go below zero. If we reduce carbon by 2100 without mitigation, warming would lead to severe, widespread, irreversible impacts. With quantitatively different risks than in action. They are not likely to be severe, widespread, irreversible risks. They persist for millennia. Come out with limited adaptive capability. Failing to present mitigation will lead to impacts beyond adaptation. And cap and trade alone solves international emissions and sparks a shift to low cost clean energy. Savins 14, a national carbon pricing regime is the only feasible way of reducing emissions 83% for those 2005 levels. Only a pricing regime provides the incentives for overall target to be achieved because of incentive to adopt cleaner technologies. The initial distribution offers a direct means of compensating equal burdens of degradation because of environmental and economic performance unaffected by the initial distribution of allowances. Private trade for means to link with other countries' climate policies, which is exceptionally important. Cap and trade has a history of successful adoption and implementation. Congress enacted cap and trade to cut sulfur dioxide emissions by half, saving $1 billion a year. Cap and trade became the most instrument of choice at cap and trade systems in China, Quebec, Switzerland, South Korea, Chile, India, Brazil, and Mexico because of the clear cap and trade the preferred approach to climate change. And the plan realigns incentives and sparks low carbon innovation. Sussman 15 utilities prior to the beginning of reducing emissions with more quickly, lower cost, and predicted the opportunity to profit from allowances. Incentive for innovation, emissions cut significantly without raising electricity costs. Cap and trade is preferable to carbon tax. The tap tightened as targets became more stringent, making allowances for expensive, incentivizing innovation on low emitting technologies. Large and diverse trade markets provide emitters with a wide variety of low cost compliant options. And the ASPER's international cooperation that solidifies existing commitments and drives international emissions reduction. Borghese Martinez 16 3 reasons drive country linking ETS. A political commitment drives a common effort to climate change linking eBay represent an effective tool to reduce greenhouse gas emissions beyond domestic borders. Second, reducing higher cost effectiveness linking ETS. A common option a wider variety of compliance opportunities, opening up a broader reference market. Third, strengthening international cooperation linking ETS may be part of a broader cooperation policy expanding into other policies between countries. The main driver of countries linking to reduce ETS establishing tighter relations in several sectors such as commercial and trade policy. Entries linking ETS may promote a consolidated broader cooperation policy. The given country linking ETS may provide a viable option to conclude the implementation of international agreement on climate change harmonization, reduces leakage. Linking ETS may increase the liquidity of the carbon market. And comparison of extinction risk demands that we move beyond standard cost benefit analysis to factor in uncertainty. That makes climate the biggest risk by far, and carbon pricing the best solution. Wagner, Weitzman 15 limit is an only catastrophe might be a potential resources. What we don't know makes it worse. The cloud can't just hide behind the standard cost benefit analysis. These scenarios have their own fat tails, underestimated and quantifiable extreme events. How likely are they to occur? The size of the impact matters for the potential to respond to distribution climate control. One chance of a highly planetary catastrophe. Our current path doesn't include 6 degrees for an indisputable global catastrophe. Second, the graph between our current efforts and what's needed is enormous. Worst case scenario, much is already being done. Third, climate change has from historical precedent. There's little reason to believe that humanity can cheat basic physics. The best climate scientists appear to be concerned about climate impact policymakers. Even if positive climate is not a worst case scenario, but there's no other problem with the probability of disaster multiplied by magnitude of disaster being high, putting appropriate price on carbon that can quickly address climate crisis. Advantage 2 is development. International emissions trading causes huge transfers of wealth to developing countries around the world, which ensures that industrialized nations pay for the abatement in developing nations. Jacob 15, the magnitude of financial transfer determined by the deviation of the permanent allocation of cost optimal abatement. The transfer volume to be significant allocation in favor of developing countries leading to substantial purpose. 750 million people live in Africa with the region. Share CO2 emissions was less than 1% financial flows from setting emissions and permits of revenues by 112 billion. A market-based approach to climate finance ensures substantial impacts to transferences of developing countries. Financial transfer to developing countries could range from almost 900 billion. Large financial flows increase investment rates, factor productivity, and reduce distortionary taxation, which promote economic growth. The current transfers related to climate finance are small. The natural resource crisis has been repeatedly challenged in studies finding that positive growth effects on relative stability pronounces and negative effects, adverse impacts can be mitigated, and combining large financial inflows with the mechanism of climate mitigation maximizes the effectiveness of sustainable human development. Tying climate finance to national carbon pricing and shifting away from project-based aid enables meaningful development in poor nations. Decal 16 carbon pricing can be operational as a sustainable development. Climate finance may play an important role in strengthening the towards emissions pricing such an approach to deviate from the current climate finance. Costs of climate measures be covered by industrialized countries. Recipient countries can fund on introducing climate policy to be stabilized. International climate cooperation is intended to prioritize the development of need price on carbon, incentivize the cost-effective mitigation that have decarbonization. Such approach would embed climate finance in the broader sustainable development initiative of recipient countries. Shifting climate finance to boundary-based disbursement. National carbon pricing has a great potential to foster both development and climate change mitigation, and inclusive sustainable development that reverses global inequality is necessary to maintain a stable Earth system and avoid transgressing planetary boundaries. Stefan et al. 15, a proposed approach to sustainable development argues that stable to New York City is a prerequisite for living societies. This will need to be implemented alongside human needs such as clean energy and adequate food. World development within the physical energy of the Earth is a necessity. Current levels of planetary progress are unevenly caused by wealth benefits are unevenly distributed. The differentials must be addressed for the system to be maintained. Earth operates with a well-defined states of process, creating destabilizing or stabilizing feedback. The strong arguments for coupling the boundaries with development, the prospect of tightening resources constraints is turning to focus on global social equity to respond to global challenges. A systematic step-by-step change is necessary in defining the safe and justified planetary boundaries as planetary operating space, and in particular these financial flows ensure global investment in sustainable development and close crucial gaps in water and sanitation infrastructure. Jacob et al. 16, revenues for carbon price reduced rate across countries. The aggregate transfers would have exceeded the current level of sustainable assistance infrastructure costs to large-scale SDG. Investment needs universal access to water, sanitation, electricity, and telecommunication essential for human development. Also determines the deprivation, social inequality gaps were more pronounced in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. 60% lack access to sanitation. The carbon pricing could achieve universal access to water, sanitation, electricity around the world. Revenues are sufficient to finance the universal access to any type of infrastructure of water, sanitation, and electricity. Combined water sanitation investment need to be fully met by carbon pricing regime for all regions. Infrastructure investments is where economic growth. The authors have found large returns of infrastructure investment to the carbon pricing revenues to be sufficient to achieve universal, even if no economic growth were to occur. Investment would yield large development benefits, while only a few percent of the carbon pricing regime revenues would stand a good chance of becoming implemented. The potential to promote human development investing in revenues is intended to implement carbon pricing in developing countries in the future. China, Korea, Mexico, Chile, and South Africa have implemented policies. Developing countries that need funds to meet the infrastructure needs that result in highlighted and considerable potential of carbon pricing to close the gap of water, sanitation, electricity, and telecommunication infrastructure, and expansion of accessible water infrastructure in developing nations is essential to combat emerging waterborne pandemics that are likely to take on exceptional virulence and drug resistance from horizontal gene transfer forward. And 15, the global pandemic waterborne disease cases heavy cold developing nations carrying most of the burden. Lack of sanitation infrastructure remain the greatest challenge of the fight against waterborne disease. Emerging risk of multiple drug resistance with the virulence appear to be transmitted globally. Unsafe water, sanitation, and poor hygiene take a toll on public health and prevention life-threatening waterborne disease. 748 million drink lack drinking water for 2.5 billion basic sanitation bathrooms become a reservoir for pathogens, allowing growth and proliferation. The recent emergent revolution of increasing concern in the virulence of highly E. coli are now appealing the acquisition of the environment via horizontal gene transfer. The vector is more virulent bacteria, strange disease-related bacteria such as cholera, and constantly evolving through cumulative efforts and mutation. Conflicts have been fought over water properties, precious water scarcity, unequal distribution of resources. Never met as extreme water is being used as an instrument of war. The challenges to minimize water scarcity and to become the cause of conflict, and the impact on global security and civilization is massive. NES 16 infectious diseases can kill millions of trillions of dollars in damage to people that the risk. The United Nations devoted a fraction of preventing disease through emission investment to upgrade the health infrastructure for low-income countries. We have neglected the dimension of global security. Preventing catastrophic pandemics is effective in retreating on top priority of infrastructure in fragile states with global capacities cannot compensate for deficiencies, and a high-impact pandemic is particularly likely even given gene transfers. Pamela Armstrong 15 infectious diseases are one of the greatest causes of mortality. Fatalities accounted by the top few elites. The majority of people who will die with the largest pandemic. The high-impact epidemic will have the greater probability of extremely devastating disease existing in nature, incurable, fatal infections, long incubation path, and combined with these future death would be extremely rapid civilization costs would be the ripple effect of fatalities and policy response.
What was the NAS card?
That was the Pamela Armstrong card. I didn't read these would include political and agricultural disruptions. But
yeah, but you read NAS.
Yeah, I read it, yes. Yeah.
The first impact card on warming says that the perception of coming crisis causes civil conflicts, risky geoengineering strategies, etc. How can the AFS plan prevent actors from responding in these irrational ways?
Our evidence indicates that instead of transitioning to large-scale climate engineering, things like geoengineering that could be potentially militarized and dangerous, that we would spark an incentive for innovation in low-cost clean energy and technology that would be sufficient in
that
order
makes
to...
sense to me for like nations participating in the global market, but like some of the most prominent geoengineering projects have been like rogue American businessmen dumping iron sulfate into the ocean because they themselves are worried.
Our
How can
evidence
you
would indicate that
pacify
those sort of
these
risky
actors?
strategies, those risky, dangerously environmental and military strategies wouldn't happen post-plan because it would change the way that energy is distributed. There wouldn't be a need for it.
Final Party Advantage says that cost-benefit analysis is flawed because there's hidden problems behind the economic assessment. How do we then determine that warming and supposedly asteroids are the scenarios with the most hidden costs?
The Wagner and Weitzman evidence indicates that we should privilege the impact of climate change because both it has historical precedent, there's science that's able to back it up, it's planetary catastrophe, it's grounded in understandings of physics, chemistry, etc.
I mean,
It says
I get that warming is real. I'm asking about cost-benefit analysis as it pertains to these
Our
hidden
evidence says though
impacts.
that those are factors that we need to take into account beyond just like a
And
basic
it says
understanding
that
of it.
specifically, the impact of climate change has fat tails in the sense that
Yeah.
there are impacts that are unquantifiable and extreme that we are a little bit uncertain about now, which means that we should be more hesitant in
The next
preventing.
advantage, I'm correct that these financial transfers will only be received if the recipient country is willing to link markets with the U.S., correct?
That's not the specific mechanism. Our Jacob evidence indicates that the revenues from the process of a cap-and-trade program would be
But-
able to result in
So
wealth
that's my
transfer to other
question.
countries.
The country has to develop a cap-and-trade program to get those revenues.
I don't think so. Oh, it
Yes,
does?
they do.
Okay, it
Okay.
does.
So what does your evidence say about countries that do not want to participate in capitalist markets?
Our evidence indicates that it would be beneficial for them and that they have an incentive to do so,
Okay.
both because of like
Um,
economics, because it
Where
lowers
does
the cost of
evidence say
abatement.
that revenue will be used for water sanitation projects?
That's what
rather
the
than
money
it
has
could
to
be?
go to towards these certain
Okay, who
projects.
mandates
It funds specific projects.
Who mandates where the money goes?
Oh, okay.
So the way that it works is there's like a nice little graphic in the Jacob piece of evidence where there are revenue streams that go towards national revenues and have incentives for mitigation. So the
Okay,
funding
incentives,
Yeah.
NAS, what is civilization?
The NAS evidence indicates that it would kill everyone, everything. If there's a certain disease, it says that there are threats to global security that come from health infrastructure being weak, that we should improve it.
It's just one up, and I send it out, but I have to use that.
More time for one and C prep. Exactly.
This is what we call blueberry time.
How are we in good blueberry season?
These blueberries are great. Do you want some?
I'm okay, thank you. But I'm sure.
I was shocked, honestly, because I feel like, not to sound like an elitist or whatever, but usually when I leave California, the fruit is not that good. And these are some great blueberries.
In California, it's like everything is in season all the time. Like, it's so good. It's always warm. I don't understand why people live other places.
So why would you send it out before?
He wanted to prove he wasn't stealing prep on his first
big deal.
half of it.
That makes sense.
One of the things that I
Sort of
posted
Why
accountability.
really thinks that the fake headers are ever going to work? He used to put like, when we'd be going for the K, he would put like 1 and C, like,
Yeah,
when you were
permits
not
on
good.
that. And he's like, it's pretty
heard a lot
clear
of
this is
people
not a
about
permits
it.
kind of plan.
That's so funny.
So, I don't know. We'll see.
I feel like I'd be the type of person who falls for it.
Yeah, you totally would.
So he might be correct. I've known him for so long.
leverage.
Or middle school. She was also called. She's being humble.
She left her stuff in the pool, so we left at like 6:30 this morning. It was not bad.
Talking about black shoes.
Clearly it's still fresh.
Look how far he's come.
Yeah.
Have you seen these shoes? I love these shoes.
Wow, those are really
DB picked them out for him.
Good work, DB.
Daryl did not pick these shoes out for me.
I mean, like, in an indirect way.
Oh yeah, he inspired me.
He bullied
He
you.
put you in that direction.
You said one off at Case?
Just one off.
Okay.
Yeah. Is everyone good? Okay. Global warming is emblematic of a society of enjoyment. The act of engagement with carbon markets avoids a meaningful confrontation with the trauma of our own desire healing. In 2014, it's important to take addiction seriously in order for address warming. The addict is mediated through language of fantasy, is open to analytic intervention, attempt to understand fantasy, carbon markets adapting through sustainable cities, zero poly defense, see the prompting defects of each one subject to avoid their own desire, confronting their own desires, like what is required to address the challenge, addiction, up to contextualize contemporary, command to enjoy intervention would entail as time to confront society of enjoyment, traverse family might allow different relationship with addiction, and politics treat the rest of addiction from the addict from the hypnotic discourse and shock them into a new level of responsibility for their own desire. A post-fantastic politics would set to the Shabbat, sharing confrontation with the problems with one another, transition down solidarity economy, movements as examples, fantasy powers founded, language failure to provide coherence, faith to provide coherence to the object form of a symptom that explains why society is full of conflict. Carbon dioxide in markets becomes the object petite that contains both our deepest fears and our desires for change. The after attempt to control it through carbon markets leads in place overall systems that make climate change never healing. In 14 old life, little markets of peoples and with the climate change are hanging over the spectrum of climate and dystopic future enemy popular to climate change discourse, trying to get out from the immediate responsible with company that is the emergence of political approach to government, which gave license to class effects of the problem. This for crippled populism, fixated expert leader control, cyber carbon dioxide makes you to become the fetish. The object petite aid that express our deepest desires, ever change the attempts to control conventions, focus on turning the emission to commodity that's been as a transaction not associated through carbon markets opposed political leader product of attack from administration not political debate the absurdity of the solution to make the existing economic good relying manufacturing pacifiable collapse carbon dioxide onto consumers. These plans take the form of gentrified response there, acting on adaptive response for preserving the larger practices that give rise to ecological changes, growth, coal fired power stations, suburban expansion, and psychic distance, systems creates well fancy to function effectively in the affirmative development project inaugurates a medicalized intervention that maintains the settler distribution of precarity and death and sanctions global violence. Ahuja instituting intergovernmental organization to cleanse developed world, transferring to the developing world the sanitary conditions, public health knowledge, prevent disease, the risk migrate, and every global globalization, the emerging disease worldview figures their pullback of colonial inequalities, emerging threats, settler space, suggest the expansion of neoliberal pharmaceutical markets combined with notices, public health, defend public health, preparedness, requires scaling up, strategies to preempt the emergence of the threats of issues of emergent circular rationalized fears about security apparatus, that's why lose sensation with the fears of the Asian body, the access to the government as species operates through the management of imperial information economy beyond turn to emergency disease, the plunge hand of the racial security state, the management of each involved military turns the camp to the emergency conversation of HMA observation refugees by the youth coast guard in Guantanamo as definitely self detention of war over the Asian refugee body, which is subject to hosts of animal microbial threat to seven U.S. concentration camp, imperial discourse, security, articulated, produced religions developed through the target dissemination of precarity and death, guides the logic of human treatment at Guantanamo, politics not proceed from formalists or technology population uniformly, and green resilient projects for reform of a new neo-imperial development that sustain inequality, Burgerla, and Bayer in 15, the discourse is event reaction to the crisis outlined above, and attempt to ensure stability in the face of changing climate. All discourse is not necessarily conservative, it's a manifestation of national competence, involves strengthening the bureaucratic court's capacity to institutions, expense of local communities, and this discourse involves exchange programs properly viewed as economic opportunity and not the rising world population seem to present new markets, green products are becoming increasingly commercially attractive. Technologies this carbon market come together in a new phase of capitalism as a whole imbued with the productive form of power that shapes new accumulation possibilities. Financial investments are forever in search of new opportunities for profit, and the affirmative relies on a disconnected liberal subject that breeds passivity and ideologically secures the function of institutional power, end up co-opting the affirmative. Class 14. Today's science appears completely fused to existing liberal market discourse, stripped of its radical potential targets, decarbonization, renewables, carbon taxes, is extended with the existing pre-existing discourse issue, routinization of market shift from actively to lobbyists and bureaucrats, and the absorption of innovations, institutional patterns, such as routinization company, by low levels of public support, markets, regulatory discourse, the growth of localities, threat of climate changing location, language of impacts itself, which reduces the neutral background, becomes abstract to the point of verification, life since administrative, rational management of the environment, constructed and system active from us, satisfied which institutions are adequate, the subject produces an environmental subject embedded within bureaucratic and market discourse rather than opposed to them, discourse pretty much to the view that we have total knowledge of the consequences, and to assume the negative outcome that could be further from the truth of theological impacts and substantial breach between the factual and the ethical political distance compounded by neutral value for your appearance, economic rationality, seems appropriate, ecological subjects to be done, the prompt to science has been brought under administrative, its proper subjects as ecology becomes technocracy, subject position has been co-opted, the channel all concerned to the bottom capital state that the room for ecological subjects and ecological concerned hijacked by agencies that gentrify, diffuse it into safe management form policies, government materialism, the subjects met with the preemptive attack from the school to the media, the co-optation of the ecological subject represents something less than a comprehensive rationalization of life, the instrumental terraforming project reshaping the earth into order of complex, so the technical sits in the field of possible subjective positions or positions of a nation relations and economy, taxpayer, consumer work. They also include the weak consistent global citizenship with differential material subject. From social subjects not to claim that subjects in time to start cycles food change. Ecosystem without the material subject, scientific discourse find themselves in a cul-de-sac facing distant everything climate change capability to act on it, the results of growth of re-governmentality is seen bound to dislocate current potential substitute for a place at the table, putting input into administrative control of the work states off the disciplinary impact upon institutions. The sheer depth of the climate crisis institutions appear unable to properly symbolize discourse, eroding a material subject represent a threat to the eco-managerial order, but the two base institutions inbuilt in the capacity to neutralize environmental concern and the cycling distancing from finitude materiality that the affirmative sustains causes fantasies of omnipotence, which are the root cause of all of their impacts and make extinction inevitable. Freud in 15. As their power multiplied through symbolic and physical two systems, we lost out to the reality of the other. We retreated into fantasies of omnipotence, self-delusion, and broad sense of the empathy. We become tools. We are in danger of ultimate perifactory ego-centered prediction of the knowledge that we are more than technology. We seem omnipotent or modal self. We identify unconsciously with. We find assurance that it is grown even more powerful from coal to oil to radium. Some still more magical power leads its ravaged land behind Earth is a hindrance to our yearning for unthreatened omnipotence. If we want to be rid of it with the advent of scientific view, powerless and nobody left except the new gods of master roads of the world, but not yet achieve omnipotence. The market means that there's no conceivable limit to commodities, technology, art, and debt. Making money has replaced the god illusion and the absence of authority, false manic view, a wave of rampant optimism, greed, overconfidence, investors, the brandscape. We shed guilt about consumption, merge with fancy, progress. They're obvious unreality, shields for the critical potential distraction from climate change ourselves. What corporations actually do, and climate change requires a psychoanalytic, ethical perspective with regard to the suffering of the other. Only the moment of trauma can breed an ethical response. Orange in 17, climate affects humans unequally to respond as globally to be traumatized, taken hostage by suffering. The distinction between voluntary and voluntary does not apply here. Double-mindedness leads to we don't know anything from people who saw their neighbors loaded into box charts like we are pretending not to know how our lives are privileged, poverty, and dangers are fellow human beings. Salvation required psychoanalytic perspective, emphasizing doomsday with collapse of meaning. We must face up to our apocalyptic anxiety before it's too late for survival. Facing up requires emotional knowledge, which the angst can be collectively held and engineering fantasy beliefs that billionaires will fix our crisis, so the rest of us need to do nothing. The solution is advantage those who are already advantaged and releasing from any obligations to the South is consistent magical thinking, absolving us from all more responsibility, and the constant impulse to act suppresses grieving from environmental atrocity, material policy failure. Vote negative to refuse hope and stew in mourning as a collective response. Mark in 16. Don't organize mourn Freudian losses, move beyond the individual separated from environment. Environmental losses are collective, they're few rituals, they inside more collective mourning butlers. Unforgivable losses consider the agency of others. Humanity's environment is worthy of grief, given our full duality, which reads out to environment. Why would anyone else destructive to practice? Grief is highly regulated. Scientists can be barren to acknowledge emotional attachment. How can we manifest an appropriate emotional response to slow violence and divide comprehension? People on Pacific shores are feeling melancholy. Free climate change generates melancholy with potentially disastrous environmental outcomes. We consume today because tomorrow may not come. We only live once. We have to purchase itself and judges preparing for the next extreme weather event. Superfund generates parental anxiety and low grade fear. The psychoanalytical model suggests healthy mourning. Commodity fetches the max vision, but side the other. We store companies looking for a lost. We fail to remember what we've lost and how environmental campaigns are marketed as commodities which consumers can choose to pick up and drop. They scramble to mobilize their next speeches on the break of station set of attempting to change the world, retaching from one losing battle to the next, one disaster to another. How about we first comprehend how we are considered by our loss of this and mourning seeks and has correlation to the lost object or other after loss of the current political response to expand discursive spaces to bodies on mourn by setting with lost opportunities can arise. One can discover reparative ethical mourning, giving language to what may have previously included in repressive frame. Drives consumption and the channeling that pain might lessen consumption, directing otherwise powerful emotions and reaction, generate community, ethical response to loss of consumption, another pathway to mourning essential to resisting the impulse to replace to move on from any excusable loss within mourning. There can be shared loss and values. These common feelings working in alienation. The burning questions: is there any hope? Is there such questions are meet for turning away for dealing with environmental problems? Those with privilege or indoctrinated narratives of problem shooting and progress pressure to produce solution and remain positive underpin. Academic and activist thoughts. Academics become depressed because there's the problem. Pathologize the impulse for hope and positivity. Hope can be cognitive dissonance when imagined ideas conflict with real. Sorry, consistent hope is utopian manner of a mind will lead from confronting fixations, the burning possibility of laboratory resurrection, confronting the enormity of ongoing historical violence can be sobering and uncomfortable. It can be silver to seek and escape action, light of dominant mode. Responding to speculative signs like you generating a true radical position might be well with loss, not respond, but instead to do. Embrace melancholy with more and mourning. We might toward a direction positioning while our grief is welcome and values of repressing negativity. Such feelings can be embraced instead of stored for unpredictable venting and burnout. The alternative is the only way to break the society of enjoyment and generate effective solutions. Healing. And 14. What does psychoanalysis offer? The process is accompanied by headaches who want to enjoy life too much. Analysis also the patient to experience ordinary unhappiness, exposing the attitude devoid of the real, but have attenuate beliefs and undiluted enjoyment, reversing the fancy of structure and addiction, and enter the relational with others. The transition time movement seeks to create post-carbon eco-municipality to function socially, accepting peak oil as a reality, and transition down seeking democratic approach solidarity movement have front around the world based on solidarity principles mutual aid rather than competition. The response is quite different from the fetish of described which we can do these movements and reject these solutions in favor of unhappiness that treats intent to political process of building communities rather than fantasies of quick fixes or denial. They venture into the social bond by figuring out what to do when the answer is not obvious. This seems to apply collectively working over a relationship with the side of enjoyment, limits that embracing hitting bottom or in relation to oil addiction as a precondition for moving beyond it. And the central question of the debate is how we respond to the psyche, voting after the dangerous palliative that gives the illusion of control by affirming your mastery over nature. Hubert's attempts us. Dodge 12. Psychoanalysis think relevant is climatology that we need combined with high-tech technical solutions that run far ahead of our psychological state. We're not at the point of being able to grasp with what we need to ask why the distinction fails to ignite motivation, confront the ecological traps, down we become not meaningful messages spread further and further, and that's not to see the correspond to concerns. There's an alarming gap between firm evidence and public response. People already are for such events indeed eager for the core issues that human response to anxiety or situation can be understood in a response to anxiety, sensitization to event, us against nature, human versus nature, order versus chaos. The myths we live by, the myths of progress. We need to find another stories to rethink what it means to progress or just to understand how we shape our world. The myth of progress and enters in culture, geoengineering, utopian techno fixes. That is at utopian techno fixes.
What counts as psychological distancing from material reality? What is like the bright line for that? What does that look like?
I don't know how to give a bright line, but our argument contextualizes it to the carbon market response to climate change and says that the thing that we refuse to confront is our own desire for consumption, growth, infinite prosperity.
Why is that distancing?
Well, it believes that the causes of the things, the causes of the problem, the issue with our own desire for a certain thing can be maintained and we can still avoid the trauma of its consequences.
How do you possibly determine what like desires, fears, etc. that are like listed?
Well, our argument isn't like any individual person has these set of emotions. It's about a collective analysis of how society is driven, adopting psychoanalytical terms to determine
how do you come to that conclusion?
Well, we can say that because society chooses to continually place faith in free markets, neoliberalism, the incentive to continue economic expansion that it desires it collectively.
Well, we can also briefly put the question back to you and ask how we can scale up to say that every market actor will behave and respond rationally to participate in our incentive.
That makes its own psychological assumption about the desires of humans as rational economic subjects.
Studies and analysis of how that's done.
We have studies as well.
Okay, the Healy evidence is about how oil markets are bad. We live in an era of peak oil. The plan is consistent with all those arguments and says that that's something like we should come to terms with and move away from and shift.
You're talking about the Healy card that says carbon markets are bad?
The Healy card that talks about oil markets. The reason.
It says that peak oil was the bender and climate change is the hangover, and that we are now in a society in which we believe that the desire that founded that bender, i.e. the idea to consume and do everything necessary for consumption, can also be the same solution, i.e. we can have low carbon development and we can spread the need for prosperity across the globe and that maintain that desire and the same stuff I was explaining above. So that's why the app doesn't solve it.
Why is that the same thing as oil markets or like peak oil? Why is that the same level of consumption?
The link isn't the app is peak oil. The link is peak oil is demonstrative of the society of desire and enjoyment.
That we create because we strive towards a cap and trade policy?
That you create because you place faith in markets, sustain prosperity, and growth as the means of growing out of the crisis. It's a means of using our own desire against.
Does the alt result in a policy action?
So the examples that our alternative evidence gives are of transition towns, which there's 1,200 of them now across the West, which are towns and collectives who brought their carbon footprint by changing consumption aligned with the global equity requirements.
How is that distinct in terms of like consumptive
Because it's not a
patterns?
market solution. It's about individuals curtailing their demand for what they want.
2019. Do you have a tissue by any chance?
I don't. Yes.
You got some tissues over here. They're also the camera stand, so just don't take too many or it might collapse.
Okay, I'll just take like 2.
That's really funny.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
What order is warming, development, and decay? Sorry everyone, this is brutal.
I'm trying to think of embarrassing Isabel's story.
There's so many.
I can't really. She's really about to do it too soon, though. It's not the time. Well, she did it. Yeah, I guess she did.
It is
She
fair.
did it
It
in
was
the
definitely-
speech. That's true.
Oh no. What's going on?
Just wait. Save it for the one round. They don't really exist.
Oh, thank you. That makes me so
perfect in my unbiased opinion.
Is everyone good? Right.
No specific defense or any internal link discussion of the affirmative means that you have a default to the affirmative internal link chain that is true. It is based off of studies and statistics and appears that prove the way that cap and trade is necessarily the best way to resolve climate change. It is the only way to resolve the Paris Commitment, which is necessary to avert a 2 degree Celsius rise and warming. The biggest impacts are already being felt but are going to escalate to the point of tipping points that lead to a collapse of biodiversity, collapse of agriculture, the economic system, and also make the world literally unlivable, which leads to extinction, which is the biggest impact of this debate, and you should evaluate it because it has the largest uncertainty associated with it, and there's no coming back from extinction. The development advantage of the affirmative leads to wealth transfers into the developing world, which allows for a focus on things like infrastructure and water development to ensure clean water and sanitation, which is necessary to resolve things like horizontal gene transfer, which resolves things like pandemics, which necessarily escalate to the point of extinction. But even if they don't, that necessarily leads to disease and access to water for large portions of the world, which is necessarily bad. The criticism framework is to evaluate the plan versus a competitive alternative as a strategy for developing effective strategies to combat climate change and violence. You should weigh the affirmative, that's key to a fair debating to preserve mechanism education, which is critical to transform the political sphere. Floated picks are bad, they mute the 1AC, so it's impossible to discuss the validity of the 1AC causal links, which is key to evaluating a particular scenario, which makes engagement impossible because debates become late breaking, which causes a substantive crowd out. Individuals determine value, which means value to life impacts are not evaluated short for the quality of life of according to individual taste, preference, and aspiration. No general principles can be asserted rational, autonomous persons can decide for themselves to disregard the possibility to imply that no individuals can make such value judgment. Consequentialism and utilitarianism is best in the context of climate change. Grasso, top climate change is unfamiliar, moral problem than not know how to feel, so feel what understand a current geological climate ethics, generally frames climate change as substantive resource sharing moral problem does not take into account the interpersonal nature of the harm that generates these approaches not resonate with human morality, can capture the moral nature of climate change, marketed to moral cognitive neuroscience, and ultimate contribution of climate ethics, or science and support for concept. Question not only because of its higher efficacy and effectiveness, but it's because its consistency with human morality, which should do it produces the best consequences. Now, there's no link to a popular which read blunt science messaging about the dangers of climate change is good wrong. Told that you meant the argument that warming communication, constant repetition of the messages of major ongoing strategies to strategies and the only time in approximating blunt science messaging social science literature cannot be clear about the only repeated message of the chance of sinking and moving the needle. Climate change is also being invisible. Issue for several years in the message of business as usual raise. Separating the politically intelligence, he heard the talk about climate change when they do, but it's into a the least word of the public choose and media that faces a vast amount of time in the notion that global warming is a hoax that's total. Yes, the somehow American public is scared to repeat my doomsday messaging, some sort of climate fatigue. The public concerned with jobs due to conservative media and misinformation campaign. The treatment of this as a non-issue about the most of the intelligence and public conscious. Some form of risk analysis is good or approach is effective and abuse some type of risk analysis with the economic injustice or redistribution rule. 10 of the common assumption that fear appeals to counterproductive. The academic leader portrays a complex picture of popular theoretic and to valid, powerful feelings of issues, saying popular messages now result in denial and empirical studies so the individual's funds will increase. Focus on collective action and challenge appraisals to those of which the perception of danger does not exceed the perception of resources. The meaningful response can be taken. The results to challenge to galvanize creative ideas and strengthen the resilience and creativity of individuals, communities, and combined fear with information that can be strongly motivated. Now
We are not a form of distancing. The climate models which were used in the 1AC are necessary to resolve things like climate change because it is a combination of smaller, because it's not just something that is based on direct human experience, but a distancing is necessary in order to better understand the climatic impacts that are more complex, and calling it all distancing is false. This is the same type of knee-jerk reaction when people were scared of things like newspapers because they say that's distancing from the real world. Now, psychoanalysis doesn't explain war. Hoffman, 86, one group looking at the show concludes the two evidence one way, the other group will the only way to move away to totally new stage of radicals and only impede form the very absence of rationality spent on radicals. Two, treated the state in terms of psychology, politics, but individual psychology and pathology. Enemies are not mere projections of negative identity. Often quite real, a few flaws and floats in private fantasy, but also concrete reality. Psychology and politics does not apply to the group of digital politics. Is paranoid, composed of people who are paranoid to view this other enemies are products of mental drive rather than the companions of social strife. Obscure the objective reason, the risk, confusion, cause and function. Deterrence can reflect the conviction that one's country is interested in the fragments of imagination, even fun. Except the metaphors of pathology can cure to be provided by politics, radicals, cures, false tales, how they get them all carried out. Psychoanalysis is factually incorrect, has no way to prove it. O'Brien and Giovanni to the prime intent of psychoanalysis, subterranean region of mind that are prevented from entering consciousness. The dynamic of consciousness is deep in trouble with methodologic difficulties with largely in recent years have shown growing practice and permanence are turned to cognitive science for empirical. But the hope is misplaced. Recent work suggests that there is time to come to dispense with this altogether. The cognitive consciousness because the latter is incompatible with the former psychological phenomena cited as evidence to be accommodated more parsimoniously. Markets are good in the context of resolving environmental destruction, right? So often every entity must navigate relations with other free entities, play a role in what is and what's not possible. Deriding market-based solutions not fair for such a response is dangerous and irresponsible. One, we live in a market-based world. There is not an alternative system on the horizon. And three, above all, we need to do something now. We should fight for an alternative ecology. Nonetheless, we have to grapple with the world that we find ourselves in. Their refusal to become impaired to work with this situation. We find them at the end of reproducing the very system narcissistically leaving their smug in their purity while everything continues to be they refuse to become politicians or engage in actors to render another to denounce that the world celebrate their soul blood depending on those who are to sustain their own position. They line up with anti-trades and protectionism and Trumpists because they're afraid of the other. Say that we should only focus on the self and what we individually focus on. Anti-globalization and localism failed. Blumberg told the Mexico Solidarity Network and the Seattle Independent Media demanded the danger function of the word design purchase imaginary agency over globalization debate allowed that the global order to dictate policies not to see that engaging institutions is bad, but rather than when engagement is at the end point to politics, the political options of exchange demands these to be recognized as powerful anti-globalization forced by W function as a concept of just mere acts of globalization over effort and level of consumption identity and so on. Refusal creates retreat from the politics of policy and public debate, commitment to marginality and for the impulse to issue and engagement with the institution. Refusal makes the often perfect enemy of the good state or institution that represent globalization or figured as illegitimate, morally, politically compromised because of their misuse of the identity. Produces not the only intimacy tied to ultimately dependent on consuming existence of the state hegemonic order of institution. The institution automatically figured in as the legitimate authority and the affirmative is a shift in orientation from Americocentrism to the and myopia of true globalism and the ethic of care of the developing the world. Neoliberalism is sufficiently adaptable, heart which the crisis has led to a renewed criticism of the market, which should lead to attacks on neoliberalism in the context of mere reflex to bring the problems of the market problems from the record and closer. Inspection perceived the market failures may be turned to failures of the policy historical and also show that their direct consequences of protectionism and interventionism. Discussion about proper political reactions are not as nuanced as they seem to be. Anti-neoliberal language relates to the free market, fundamentals of mainstream capitalism and excessive predation of the criticism of laissez-faire out of the less the recognition of the powerful markets and skepticism and state power to the core of neoliberal project. Neoliberalism is a form of ritual thoughtful concept within a perceived today to those criticizing neoliberalism. The answer maybe we need one of this kind of less which would be less of the historical abuse of neoliberalism. The political purposes now the alternative lives with climate skeptics and deniers because they said that we shouldn't do anything and we should just focus on individuals changing their own consumptive basis on what they want to do, which leads to climate deniers not doing anything and just continuing to pollute even more. Individual focus destroys progressive climate politics. Carson 12. Environmental theory tends to overlook the difference between individual collective action, takes a left effort, provide a meaningful effort through accelerated technological paths of sustainability, dependent radical political action, commitment to investment in the present of the environment to move for persistence on innovation driven future becomes ethically problematic. So the activists need to persuade mainstream politicians for radical investments in the breakthrough technology. Safety will need to be reduced to the country. Visit former studio for people in which country to develop new management technology. Only if technologies are faster, cleaner, and cheaper can we expect them to be implemented by individualizing political change. We risk losing the collective force and say the future becomes marked by scarcity and the most likely to be defeatism than meaningful action. Now the market is key to motivation is the only way to lead to lead to incentives to lead to innovations in carbon effective technology. Also allows for wealth transfer from the wealth transfer to developing nations, which is the only way to lead to motivation because right now countries in the developing part of the world don't want to do things like carbon tax and renewable energy because it's extremely expensive and they want to focus on living standards, whereas the affirmative allows for a collaboration of the two things where they can have living standards alongside with renewable development. Now the alternative can't solve because there's no way to change someone's desires for consumption. The only realistic way to change consumption patterns is by forcing it via something like a cap and trade system. If we force on these individual desires, are going to always end up with the elite who it's more profitable for them to continue things like polluting. Changing the market mechanisms is the most effective way to do so. What the alternative never leads to action, and that calls to step back and think are philosophically counterproductive. Harmon 5. Critical thinking must the triviality of object act as missing political events as beneath your attention. Others challenging the that perseveres to endless world to be toking holes in others' augmentation. Many think that philosophy amounts to nothing more than the ability to knock on their corners. Critical thinking becomes counterproductive. It's not all philosophers, but hipsters who replace us with everly might criticize what distinguish humanity's expansive fascination. We place out for the fascination of the towards a cosmos. The distinction between critique and fascination is just a very different philosophy from the popular word of critical thought of constructive thinking. But real and critical readers would have vulnerable ones that can recognize a good idea when they see it. The critical intellect lays the survey from the lofty tower only intended. Thinking is able to be surprised when only able to think exchange contact with the world. Thinking cements us to universe rather than freeing us from the engineer. New devices, far more thinking the critical Heideggerian who complains vaguely that we should stop and think of it before using a tool to invent me to build myself in motion whatever is invented to critique without the innovating limits lies we remain where we already stand merely trapped on the trees planted by the reactionary gesture of enlightenment was one of the debunking traditional piety should be one of creating new ones. They do not lead to a mindset shift. No one wants to stop consumption trainer. Fatigue growth literature deals mainly with the problems of generating reference to alternatives usually at the level of generalization. Too little attention is gone to the alternative. Society is scarcely and gives him to give recognition to the vague implications of scarcity and for reality. We're going with the need for radical cultural change to be with the problematic element of the transition to post-abundant society. TSW cannot come to work unless there's a strong concern for the public good, social responsibility, willingness to contribute, desire to care and nurture collectivism and contentment with radical frugality. The dominant orientation would have to shift. TSW cannot have unless the thinking of people comes to contradict the fundamental elements that have driven Western society. Also, the alternative has no time frame. At what point do we stop reveling in the suffering that is ongoing and lead to any type of action? The affirmative is responding to ongoing impacts of climate change and poverty and water sanitation problems that are ongoing and has a solution to try to resolve them. Obviously, not everything is perfect, but rather that we lead to a good change in the right direction. Now, their politics is backward, collapses into alliance with Trump, Wilson, one failing to present a comprehensive alternative to international trade, left protesters, the accusations of being naive and protectionist, no alternative institutions where proposed America, first not progressive perspective without a progressive vision of liberals and the protest against free trade become to merge with a narrow-minded conspiracy theorists about the UN, or the WTA taking over the world. It becomes difficult to win an argument. Progressives can prove they're not against trade. They can also counter the myth that the United States is a paragon of free trade. The United States is the king of corporate wealth for free trade, not to be progressive. But this from the progressives seek out only to oppose free trade rather than question too many. They've already lost the argument.
We used 8 seconds. What empirical evidence is there to establish the claim that your ROM evidence makes in 2012 that doomsday and scientific messaging gets people aboard climate change?
So ROM cites a few reasons. ROM says that scientific messages have the chance of making people understand the magnitude of the issue because when they focus only on what impacts them, people are more prone to be like, oh, nothing is changing for my life. Scientific.
The thing I want to get at is that it's from 2012, and in the 4 or 5 years after this card was published, a heavy campaign of science and doomsday messaging.
Yeah, and that led to things like the Paris Agreement, which is good, because people are focusing on science and are like, CO2 is actually bad. That led to one of the biggest international climate agreements. What's necessary now is actual action that solidifies that.
Conservative response in places
Which, the scientific rhetoric itself is what led to the Paris Commitment. We think that acting based off of that is good.
But it gets rolled back.
But it's not, because it hasn't.
Okay, the Hoffman evidence you read says that, first of all, it's okay if people that, when approaching international relations, focus on the psychology of individual leaders as opposed to collective psychology. How does this apply to arguments about the environment or arguments about society?
So first you make an impact claim that it leads to a form of endless war. We think that it's impossible to determine how individual, so if it's first of all impossible to determine one individual's psychology and their desires to go into things, that makes it even more difficult on a collective level.
Okay, but the argument this makes is indicting people who were like, the reason North Korea acted this way is because
right. So first of all, that applies to the story of the critique, because the critique is like the reason why people are acting this way is X based off of their psychology.
Let's talk about framework. What's your account of the relationship between reading the AF, voting AF, and any of the impacts you've isolated?
So we think that first of all, the discussion that the 1AC has had is good. We don't need to win that. We think that endorsing the plan is a good thing. Like fiat is.
Why? Why is it good?
So the ROM evidence indicates that science is an effective communication strategy, but we don't need to win any of these, like...
So the app is good because you talked about science. That's the reason...
That's one thing. Yeah, it's important to communicate about climate change. It's important for people to know that it's not, that it's something that's occurring, that cap and trade is a good way to resolve it and
talk
these
about
policies.
This Lundberg card you read.
Yeah.
So this card, which is about psychoanalysis, as in uses psychoanalysis to establish its claim, says that the structure generates enjoyment of the existence of oppressive state policies as a point for the articulation of identity. The addiction to the state and the demand for
Lundberg evidence
is bound up with a fundamental dependency on the oppression of the state.
The Lundberg evidence indicates that when groups have been anti-globalization and only focused on the local, and gives the examples of the Zapatistas in Mexico and the Seattle anti-WTO protesters, they fail to ever actualize change because they didn't link up with other groups.
Yeah, so
that's the same logic of the alternative.
That the reason that they all failed is because they didn't question desire at the heart of their politics.
Lundberg says
to maintain the same.
Lundberg says that the reason why they failed is because they didn't link up with other groups.
Okay. It's the case starting with You should refuse to weigh the plan. Our gloss and evidence indicates that the position of the ecological subject requires a fantasy of mastery over institutions of governance and markets to resolve the problem without questioning the addiction to consumption that structures the modern society of enjoyment. If we win this argument, then you should center your ballot on the question of desire, and our response to the unconscious or Dodd's evidence indicates that the only way that we will scale down social values away from a fantasy of limitless growth is a centering on the individual and the collective, at both levels, shared fantasy of enjoyment and desire beyond limits. This is the root cause of all of the affirmative's impacts. The evidence that they have read at the very bottom of the flow from Traynor and also the evidence from Lundberg both agree that the only way to shift social values is if movements and individuals collectively recognize that institutional arrangements have locked them into a development path that is against their own interests and serves the minority of neoliberal elites. The only way to resolve this is to move entirely outside of those institutions. The question of desire is the critical motivation for people to have a revelation that they have hit rock bottom, that the society of enjoyment has utterly failed them, and that the only response can be a collective mourning of our modernity of the present world and the demand for a transition to a new one. There is no floating pick, which means the theory arguments here are irrelevant. Their fairness claims are arbitrary and self-serving. Only debate about the justifications and motives for the plan is educational, because both Kissinger and the pacifists want us out of Afghanistan, and the entire debate is over why you lead, what worldview leads you to the conclusion of that plan text. Finally, if we win framework arguments about centering desire, we don't need an alternative. Merely saying no to the affirmative reveals the fantasy and is enough to solve. It also means that saying yes to the affirmative necessarily corrupts the permutation. Dean 6. Enjoyment close all they get back, and there's a deep little bit of like even the most rational ways to think of enjoyment is not of what was easily theorized, revolutionary politics, through occupation, the excessive of the concept, this excessive place in its formula for the analyst. The analyst just sits there asking questions from time to time. Should some kind of object of decipher on which the analyst tries to provide. The analyst refuses to provide any answers whatsoever. This makes the analyst so traumatic. She refuses to establish law or set a limit. Should not focus on some kind of new master analysis over when the analyst said, except the analyst did not know there's not a secret meaning or explanation. It takes responsibility becoming aware of misperception graphically within the work of analysis. The analyst that externalization gives a new form to activity, saying things I'll represent them to another confronting the concretized in a regional knowledge in a different way. There's more difficult to avoid because all these not capable to arrive, but naturally it has to be produced. Excessive object cannot easily be assembled. These stands of positions that the analyst will the parties want to tell us what to do to find an ultimate solution to solve all the world's problem. The analysts do not find ideals and goals. We work these out for ourselves, market ourselves. They say value to life is inevitable. This is the neoliberal conception of subjective pleasure that ensures that people are taken care of as long as they have access to market goods. The argument made in our orange evidence is that you should adopt a relational conception of value, which is attuned to the violence of history, the occluded and invisible others that are necessary for us to cohere a psychical image of the world in which our lifestyles are ethical and valuable and should therefore be extended to others. It forgets that for us to arrive at the current moment of the developed world, there must have been colonialism, slavery, etc., which means that their utilitarianism argument is a historically isolated and presumes a universal understanding of costs and benefits that relies on a transparency of desire to maximize the good, which occludes over differences in how individuals interpret social value. For instance, the Zapatistas, Via Campesina, and Unity and Struggle are all indigenous groups that have rejected the Paris talks and protested climate councils with public vigils and displays of mourning because the economic logics that create the carbon targets that they are invested in require the erasure of those people's ways of life and the social or spiritual conception of value that drives them. This means that their endorsement of the commodity structure is founded on a disavowal of the death drive through a promise of endless and universal enjoyment. This ensures cycles of fundamentalist violence that wreck affirmative solvency and evacuate life of meaning. McGowan 13, there was no appeal, death itself, the fact life is enemy, was who value something is about the value that death provides, not alive, nor ice cream, nor anything but happening, for whatsoever happening, if in time we have no incentive, we will be left unable to enjoy, but one choice, one X to the infinite as finite subject destroy renders enjoyment enjoyable and privateness of destiny. Ideology that claims life is the only value, creates a valueless world where nothing matters. The exclusive focus on life at the expense of death never finds enough life and remains dissatisfied. Dissatisfaction is built into the commodity structure. Focus on life is the effect of producing eruptions of death. Value disappears. Fundamentalist violence return. What modernity symbolic structure cannot accommodate violence and blowback, not simply to respond to imperialist aggression of leftist common sense would have the violence marks the return of what modernity necessarily forecloses. They say that you have to make people scared of climate change. No uniqueness for this. That was the cross-sex. People are rapidly turning against ecological progressivism. Additionally, people deny because of repressed desires, which means that the easy fix is the exact same logic as the Heartland Institute, and they breed passivity, which makes denialists more powerful. Healy 14. Sustainable responses are a palliative fantasy because it pacifies the subject. No sacrifice required to trust in the architecture, transfer Christ, and engineering, utopia, fantasy, cooperation, revenue, change, social organization, will leave the system in place, surplus of expenditure revealed to deep investment, preserve an order against any determining incurrence of the side of the Victoria rest on fantasy. There's no problem with property, any force against are continuously repeated. Each mobilize the hypnotic quality to place the subject that's 12 repetitive sheets. Second, assist problems are easily solved. There's no problem with there's the promise we'll quit tomorrow. What problem? The point is speech avoids collective confrontation with the issue. Post all these promises an easy cure, and denials issued by the Heartland Institute are simply a vacillation between admission and denial that is common to all addicts. The argument also about risk good is solved by the alternative. Our question is, how do you respond to the trauma of climate change? We will win that mourning and confrontation with trauma and loss are the only way to resolve it. They say that climate change is indirect. This is exactly our link argument. This is only true when you adopt the economic blinders that separate the self from the other. We are not a form of individualism, a radical shattering of the ego and the conscious notion of a divided, discrete neoliberal subject, which means that it is a connection to the historical conditions and social realities that produce human existence. So it's a more relational conception that activates collective politics. They say psychoanalysis is wrong. The best studies go neg. Posado 10. 3. Lacanian orders relate to basic errors in neural anatomy. Left and right neocortex plus subcortical areas human evolved the same functional areas. Language system of the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere with the right brain size of the emotional system. Left cortical functions correlate with the concept of the word language with the imaginary limbic system with the real correspondence confirmed by research on development and growth spurts in the neocortex during childhood. In Lacan's theory, the mirror stage neuroscience shows right brain between mother and child shapes emotional perceptual pathways, brain images that offend the fundamental behavioral choice. Lacan's three orders not only relate to anatomy, but Donald's theory about cultural development and ancestors evidence of increasing brain size. Early hominids develop a new cognitive capacity. Homo sapiens gradually evolved mystic stage of brain development and evolved fundamental change in the human brain innovation. Left, right, and low by language. Human brains bear awareness of animal emotion that drives up primal awareness. Less than 10% of brain activity is conscious, and deliberative theory is not falsifiable. Their repetitions of scientific messaging is equally scientifically bankrupt. Mutz 8. The falsifiability is the most interesting issue of getting empirical research. Deliberative theory deliberation is simply defined as intrinsically good. Such claim range tradition to develop beyond the general issue of falsifiability. Deliberative theory falls short of meeting requirements for virtually any textbook. Clearly defined concept specification, logical relation to my concept consistency between hypothesis and evidence tests do not develop well-specified explanation for proposed benefits of deliberative theory. Takes into political discourse. Hypotheses are not grounded in evidence. They say that markets are and our impact is not about war. It's about forms of lash out that will happen through pathologizing those who continue to consume. The carbon market assumes that we will rationally be pleased with giving others the rights to the enjoyment that we think we deserve. Our argument is that this will intensify new forms of surveillance and hatred that divide the world into blocks of the developing versus the developed that will fight beyond the market within forms of deportation, drone strikes, etc. This is not about whether or not we can read into Kim Jong-il's mind. This means that the market's good offense will be in the 1 and R. Let's go to the alternative. Ecological devastation is a mere symptom of a society of enjoyment attempting to cover over a foundational trauma of the real. The inability to express the subject's desire on its own terms means that all the easy fixes provided by the other continue a fantasy of limitless growth and omnipotence, which the Freud evidence says leads to planetary mastery, makes extinction inevitable. This ensures additionally that societies will fail to develop the prosperity that they say, but when this happens, we will only force more neoliberalism. The only way to confront this unconscious desire is the refusal of hope entirely for a full-fledged confrontation with trauma and loss. Mourning solves 3 reasons. 1, it generates collectives. Emotions are the basis of community like transition towns and indigenous struggles. 2, it prevents burnout. Activists fail to repeat their messages and succeed, which causes people to give up on politics. And 3, it prevents aggressive reattachment. Loss of the object of stable market success causes lash out and aggression, which means they will fail. I'm going to take 1 second of prep.
So explain to me how you take someone like an oil executive that's been polluting and like this is profitable for them, change their mindset into one that they're like, consumption is bad, I care about everyone.
I don't think that's the point of the alternative.
So then how does
Sorry.
the alternative lead to any change in consumptive practices or resolving any of the impacts that you
Because it
outlined?
leads to collectives that challenge the society.
How? If you can't lead to changes in mindsets of people
Well,
like
like-
oil executives, who is forming these collectives? People that already agree with it?
No, the people who are currently invested in the fantasy of sustainable development and a green solution to fundamental contradictions in a society of endless growth.
So then I guess that
So
brings me to my other
Those are
point.
not the oil executives because they don't
So
care
you
at
take
all. They
someone
don't-
that supports a policy like cap and trade, how do you
Yes.
take them and say, what is the outcome that happens post saying like consumption is bad?
There's three elements. The first is the development of collectives. The second is the prevention of burnout by refusing
Wait, but you're
to
not answering
follow-
my question, which is how do you get like from point A to point B? Like what causes this person to
So, yeah,
suddenly be
there's-
like, now I'm
there's
only gonna focus
ana-
on these little collectives?
So analysis is a process. Our Dean evidence says that the confrontation with desire occurs through a continual questioning of why the subject
So
believes
every
that certain
individual has to be
solutions can
psychoanalyzed
work.
continually, and then
Well,
that
our evidence says that
leads to-
everyone is always doing that to everyone all the time. And
But then
the
how
only
does
way
the-
that you
how does
can
the alternative-
effectively mobilize that for social change is to connect it to collective
But how
structures
does
of
the
desire,
alternative do
i.e. the
that?
society of enjoyment.
How does the alternative do that though, or why does
The
it?
alternative does that by connecting the denial that produced the crisis in the first place to the palliative that suppresses the violence that would be necessary
That
to
doesn't make
implement
any sense.
a
Okay, how do you
continual
determine the
consumption
social value
society
of
in a
people?
green world.
How do you determine the social value of people or what people value? Make an argument that's like we cloud over the things people socially value. How do you make
Because
those judgments?
We don't make a determinate judgment on what value is.
So
for
then how do you
people.
make determinations about what's the largest impact, what actions to take, etc.? Do you focus on things that are only affecting you? Do you focus on things
No.
abroad, etc.?
Our argument is that the impact calculus for the judge should be determined through the suppression of desires that are
That
expressed.
doesn't make sense. How do you determine what desires people are suppressing? Like, who determines
No, it's
this?
about the prevention of us suppressing the desires of others. So our argument is that economic logics and market reforms necessitate
So-
that people express their wants and their needs in a cost-benefit frame that inherently brackets out a spiritual or non-economic understanding
so
of value,
the argument,
which
just to be clear. So the argument is there are non-economic forms of desire that exist. The affirmative prevents those.
Yeah.
And that's good?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so if the affirmative still allows for those non-economic forms of desire, is that okay?
Well, no. There are other impacts.
It's finishing where John left off, and then
Is anyone not good?
They say anti-globalization leads to America first. There's no link to this argument. The alternative is a process of collective mourning, which would not be the link to any of these arguments. It assumes a different type of protest and talk about people like Buy America Now. The permutation, multiple reasons why the inclusion of the affirmative complicates the ability for the alternative to solve any world of the permutations. One is that it makes a confrontation with the trauma of desire impossible. So confronting desire is something that's necessarily traumatic and difficult and requires sustained intervention. Any move to do something that can maintain economic prosperity, etc., would confront that process. Second, the Glass and evidence indicates that the ego subject always ensures that there will be some form of co-option. This means that if we win any link argument to the alternative, then it co-opts the ability for any link to the permutation co-opts the ability for the alternative to solve. Third, they have considered the arguments about how there needs to be an ethical pause in order for mourning to take precedent over organizing. The once the alternative evidence indicates that because we're so driven by the need for immediate solutions, it prevents the ability to deal with the trauma of climate change. The only thing that can solve that is a break. The inclusion of the affirmative would mean that that break is corrupted because there would not be a moment of pause. It prevents rather than any moment of reconciliation. The alternative is what happened post-genocide in Rwanda, in which there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that caused us to reconcile and deal with the horror of the genocide. Instead, the affirmative and the permutation is the war on terror that deals with the trauma through lashing out violently. Now, there's multiple external DA to the perm. The first is the petite object argument. The specter of a climate dystopic future that animates the 1AC generates a desire for an immediate response. This is a way of distancing because it locates the issue of climate change in terms of expert determinations, not the ethical questions of individual actions and choices. This is an impact term to their market solution. CO2 becomes a fetishized object that expresses both our fears and desires we attempt to control in order for climate change to be reduced to a technocratic issue. It's not about a fundamental conflict between consumption patterns and the devastation that it has on the environment. Instead, in a world of the affirmative, a world of the permutation becomes a conflict over management systems, transaction costs, international linkages, and how the CO2 system is developed. There's two impacts to this argument. The A is that it erases the alternative solutions. Our Healy evidence indicates that if you avoid the antagonism at the heart of consumption, ecological devastation, it means the permutation cannot solve because it obscures that. The B is that it makes climate change inevitable. The only way we can solve climate change is by a total destabilization of our consumption patterns. We would need to end all even IPCC estimates said that we need to end all fossil fuel extraction immediately and have drastic reductions in consumption, which is what the cap and trade would have to result in if it were to solve. It means that whenever there's a conflict between our own comfort and emissions, we will co-opt the trading system in order to avoid creating discomfort. This doesn't have to happen in any particular way, but there's multiple ways that it could happen. For example, the Kyoto program failed for cap and trade because we had an offset system in which people were able to externalize that there could also be intensity changes that change how we measure emissions. We could also export it globally. All of these demonstrate that the cap and trade isn't guaranteed to solve, but the question of whether or not there is a collective society that's willing to make the necessary consumption changes. Our psychology first argument that you should be skeptical of any system that promises an easy way out of the climate crisis. They say that markets work. The Brian card they read here is terrible. It just says that there is no alternative to markets. Things like transition towns and all of the global solutions to climate change that are emerging in non-market countries demonstrate this, and it also it doesn't indicate that markets would be effective. Second is the liberal subject. The affirmative sustains the notion of a detached liberal subject that is disconnected from the environment and each other. It is a neoliberal fantasy of the atomized individual. Their faith in markets treats all individuals as rational economic units that will always respond the same way. The very basis of a carbon market is the assumption that people weigh their own attachment to leisure equally with economic costs, and it can be made commensurate in that basis. There's two impacts. The A is that there's three impacts. The A is that ensures that we cannot have a meaningful confrontation with desire. If we only view other individuals as if we sublimate all of their desires to the question of economics, we cannot view that relationally. That's impacting the 2 and C. The B is that it turns case because it means that new ecological issues arise. There's a fundamental argument separate from markets that's about the distancing of humans from the environment. Our evidence says that even if we solve climate change, other issues will arise, which means that there is a whack-a-mole effect. That means the F can't solve. C is the Freud impact dropped into 2AC. It's an independent immortality argument. Human mastery over the environment is only secured by a fantasy in which we view the environment as something that is a limitation on our own ability to be immortal. Every time there's an ecological limit, we say that it's a constraint on our ability to one day be fantastic, which means that ecocide is the result of us developing new and new technologies in order to demonstrate our own ability to be immortal in spite of the environment. That's why we develop new things like emissions, etc. The result will be advanced technological warfare that only can result in extinction and further ecocide. The final D is our development arguments. No enter in the 2AC. The Hucha evidence says the idea of developing developed countries emerging with pandemics that are a threat to what they call civilization, and the 1AC encourages a system of global biopolitical arrangement and where the West is obligated to manage who lives and dies. When health becomes a global management issue, it justifies things like intervention or ensure that people who are a threat to the order of society have to be eliminated. It has two impacts. The A is that it creates a system in which life and death and precarity itself is something that requires to be managed by the West. It ensures things like Guantanamo Bay, in which humane treatment became something, a health signifier in order to manage the health of the populations. The B is that it makes disease inevitable because our evidence indicates that the reason there's pockets of underdevelopment is because of a system in which those lives are viewed as disposable, which cause disease that then come up and back against us now. It also means that they can't solve water, par in 13. Water market organized who can afford water and who cannot control capitalism that drug cycles healthiest. When it operates closest, the value produced by the drug cycle is moving beyond 2,000 to generate exchange value, which is further the moves that drug cycle to exchange value. The labor of material life are brought under the control of capital, alienates material life from the cycle to creative capacity, pass-through physical life desalination, induce chemical biological contaminants, create agriculture to solve primes, technology is appropriate by private sector under the guise of providing public service, found practice lean, water conservation act as a foreign emerging market, and desalination include the usual list of multinational water moguls. Water expensive double-digit growth rates, not bad, just prediction was made during the economic meltdown. Social relations are implicated in each other. We need to capture the the institutionalized systems of oppression, hierarchy, social arrangements that work equally for everyone. Although water returns to the people after the projected water was long-standing class of branches, agriculture, open, corrupt, and poor residents for strong for reliable and safe access to water. Water is not gender neutral growth. Room for school systems, collection, water for the time, subsistence, agriculture, simply reinforcing the acuity, to power, the disadvantage, women, inequality, dispensary, topical, government, separate the not social arrangements, lawful legal participation, the story of intrusion, market criteria, less lucrative, speculative economy that is growing, is driving the push of privatized water companies, required multilateral approach for water alliances are formed, enemies, no tech transfers, brown and all 14 below transfer, of those technologies, feature highly professional exploitation of the power of technology, solve energy, global challenges, frame of low carbon development tends to result in limited policy for the next important teachers about technological transfer, successfully achieving setting goals like energy access, more complex supply, such as technology share, observe provision policy steps to consider infrastructure expansion, guarantee access, emphasizing quality, reliability, affordability, supply, such approach to development team, leveraging finance.
not ready? Warming development, the critique. The fact that they have no specific evidence in the context of cap and trade proves that this is how denialism is able to happen when skeptics don't engage with the specific policy details or science behind these studies. They're based on studies, statistics, and empirical models that determine that warming is the biggest impact because it results in biodiversity decline, agricultural collapse, destruction of the global economy's rise in sea levels makes the world physically unlivable because of things like flooding, and it becomes too hot, results in extinction. You can only die once and there's no coming back from it. The development advantage, the plan results in a massive wealth transfer that allows for clean water and improvement in infrastructure and sanitation that gives rise to both better living conditions to be able to solve things like poverty, but also prevents horrible diseases that result from horizontal gene transfer where they're able to move between species and escalates to extinction. Even if we don't get there, it results in billions of people dying in bloody deaths from things like cholera. The critique, you weigh the AF because we should center the centering the discussion on the AF is a good strategy. You should center your decision on if the AF is a good strategy to combat for climate change. No root cause argument because social values need to focus on collective values to the alternative isn't able to solve for their impact or results in a problem shift because mourning never actually spills up to macro political action, or there's no reason articulated for when it's ever good enough to create any sort of change. The framework debate, ASA point is that we should get to weigh the AF or that we should be cost benefit analysis. ASA point is fairness, otherwise it moves 9 minutes. So the 1AC means that the 2AC has to start over and justifying every epistemology, which is infinitely regressive. BSA point is the resultant cost benefit analysis, which is key to mechanism, education, and decision making, so that we consider the implication of our actions, which is key to advocacy skills and responsibility. CSA point is that our framework allows for a macro-micro focus and combination of science with the implications on a more local level that allows us to form an ethics of care that's necessarily beneficial. Now, yes, you need an alternative because climate change is important and has a big impact, so you should hold them to it because any solvency deficit means that you should default to the precautionary principle. We're rapidly approaching certain tipping points in regions like the Arctic, so any risk that the alt isn't able to solve for climate change means that there's a massive warming to to the critique. Now, Dean doesn't turn it off with our permutation argument. The two approaches are not fundamentally incompatible because the AF allows for non-economic value forms and action in the world of the affirmative in the first place. Life should come first because we shouldn't foreclose the possibility of life for others in like the developing world or anywhere in the world. It's a question of what more we do moving forward in spite of horrible things that have happened in the past like slavery and colonialism, but specifically it's important to move forward in the context of climate change. You can't determine value for other people. The only objective measure is consequentialism and utilitarianism. Otherwise, it's analogous to saying that some lives matter more than others, especially in the context of governments, because they can't. It's the only way that they can make ethical calculations. But extinction and life comes first because you can only die once and it's irreversible. There's no coming back from it at the biggest magnitude, especially in the context of climate change. Our evidence indicates that since it's an unfamiliar moral problem, we should default to being careful in order to create actual action against it. The McGowan death drive argument isn't able to explain all of the worlds which all of our psychoanalysis indicts apply to. Rather, we don't say that we're always driven towards death, or that extinction is inevitable, but rather that there's a specific instance of it that we're able to avoid people dying violently from the world just simply being too hot to live in. Cross-sex was way better for us on the science message and good debate because it proves the Paris argument about how it results in a huge internal effort. It doesn't lead to zero policy failure, but rather the fact that we need repeated messages in order for repeated big messages based in science for the message to sink in that global warming is something real. It makes it visible and puts it in the public consciousness. It also allows for challenging of denialism through the formation of education, because people value things like statistics and models that we're able to produce through science, which rely on actual temperatures and calculations that they produce. Now, models debate. There's obviously some risk calculus is inevitable, but the asked form is good because otherwise it results in pictures that are salient and result in collective action because they make issues more focused on the public mind. It also changes appraisal and results in more creative ideas, which solves your death drive arguments. Models are not just human, though; they rather just take into account the climate. Your Mutt's the distancing leads to fear argument is also a non-starter because it doesn't make any sense. It's the same type of argument that says that newspapers, texting, or social media is the form of distancing from material reality. If anything, you are the form of ivory tower philosophizing that our evidence criticizes. It's impossible to determine why people act in certain ways, which is our psychoanalysis bad arguments. There's no part of the brain that solely determines how we act, and you can't tie it to any sort of empirical analysis. Their evidence is from a psychoanalyst, so of course that person would say that it's verifiable. But the science behind cap and trade, the science behind climate change and reason reasons why cap and trade are good are the only ways to, and cap and trade being the only way to solve, are verifiable. Even if things like communication aren't perfect, it proves that the alternative, they can't prove that the alternative will work, but we can prove that the AF will specifically. You can't determine individual desires, let alone things like actors on a macro scale of issues like climate change in the first place. Markets are good. They've conceded that it's key to motivation because it allows people to understand that we can both have renewables and a certain level of living standards. We should fetishize CO2 because CO2 is bad, and we do address the antagonisms of consumption. That's the reason behind acting in the 1AC to change developmental standards. They don't have any evidence that's in the context of the AF. We don't actually lead to offsets. We should get to determine what the AF does, and Crossix proves that you don't change the mind of people. You only change it via markets. They are also inevitable because there's no alternative system to grapple them with it, and it changes the distribution of resources. They pull the rug out from those who are living by raising energy prices in the first place. We need to change the system. The alternative fails. A sub-point is that how do you move to collective action on climate change from just starting on a mindset shift? There's no reason why they can actually change the minds of people. B sub-point is that it destroys the localism fails because local groups don't actually create change because the Zapatistas had the opportunity to link up internationally, but their local focus meant that they weren't able to in the first place. They also result in the same form of denialism which is proven by the Seattle anti-globalization proofs, because when you rebel against these issues, it means that you're not, it means that your ideology aligns with those, who are skeptical of the issues in the first place. It's also infinitely regressive, and our evidence indicates that which evidence indicates that perfect becomes the enemy of the good, and it doesn't result in any sort of ideal transition to a different economy, because the problem was not with the economics, but with the policy specifically. No disease link argument or interventionism. Our internal link is about clean water and sanitization that's based on not based on who can afford what, but rather that everyone should have access to some amount of clean water and food.
Alright, we have a minute. Did we offload the 1NR on a separate sheet? Oh, never mind. I'm sorry.
It's probably some of the 1NR docs that we didn't finish.
This is fine. This is fine. I don't want to read it on there. Reading, please. Please. Alright, did we all flow the 1NR on a separate sheet?
I just started flowing it where you were done.
Okay. I'm going to be starting with the 1NR turns case arguments. Why?
You'll do great.
After you finish that though, are you going back to the top with like the framework
Of the
you said?
1AR. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. If we win the theses and the K takes out all of affirmative solvency, it means they cannot leverage a try or die scenario against the alternative. Markets are merely venues for human desire to be expressed and negotiated. If we win a competitive theory of desire, then it shapes how cap and trade will go down and be implemented to preserve the comfort of the first world, the society of the enjoyment which is addicted to consumption and comfort. They do not mandate wealth transfers. This is only if people accede to the carbon consensus and develop capitalist economies, and then only if those monies get chosen to be developed for water sanitation projects, etc. All of this determines a social shift in values towards sustainable and equitable development, which is not guaranteed. Our argument indicates that they have conceded the argument about wanting what the other has. The claim that we will give the rights to pollute to people who are different than us causes racialized divisions. That means we will put these people under constant surveillance. If they fail to meet targets and agree with our vision of the consensus, they will be struck with sanctions and limited out of the market. This has happened throughout the history of neoliberalism with WTO adjustments like the Bretton Woods Agreement that caused pockets of underdevelopment. They made poverty, overconsumption, and disease inevitable. All of this was conceded by the 1AR, which merely presumes that the market solution is a guaranteed fix. The very naturalness and easy fix nature of the solvency argument is exactly why you need to submit it to extreme skepticism. The fetish of the CO2 reduction as solving ecological crises overlooks a series of problems that are inherent in consumptive patterns. The Freud evidence is phenomenal and simply dropped. It says that our obsession with technology and market fixes is based on an immortality wish that causes us to hate the earth as a finite material limit on our transcendent powers of rationality. This is the root cause of all technological disasters in ecocide. The emissions that we see are equally substituted by biotechnical fixes that would re-engineer humans to prevent disease but only engender new forms of violence and risky disease and other disease risks, as well as nuclear power that has inherent risks of safety and radioactive contamination, artificial intelligence that makes market management systems absurdly efficient, and geoengineering itself. They've conceded that they cannot stop rogue actors from engaging in these sorts of violent technological destructions against the environment, which means that they're ratcheting up of anxiety and fear-based messaging without confronting the trauma of the heart of consumption society, means that there will only be more responses that ensure further consumption and ecological destruction that makes their impacts inevitable. Now, the carbon market will fail. They've conceded that it has to be implemented in the correct way, which could be messed up by offsets, intensity targets that redefine the measure of emissions, exporting to non-capitalist countries that refuse to be integrated within linkages, and all of it relies on modeling and tech transfer, which we have said is impossible within neoliberalism because it focuses on a universalized notion of finance, which means other countries won't accept the technology or be able to effectively use it, so they never get to the green revolution. I'm finishing the card. Roll out the technological presence, develop an independent market that produce effective, sustainable, financial, technical, corporate, expert, other more critical, rather than secular engagement with transforming green economy, thinking that's social, environmental, cost, contract, capital, civil, less powerful, always engaged for technology, to green topics, real have lower capital, or the great
economy of the export initiative for northern economies embrace link slave trade, they mention of being approach from a great economy, puts other side of competition advantages, disadvantage, limited out the removal of agricultural zones, that is part of green amounts of all significant advances, spending market, social relations, industrial practices, and regulatory regimes across countries means they don't solve any of the water development. They've conceded the PAR evidence that says that planning from the market fails because it ignores social relations, gender disparities, and cultural water practices that causes worse water failures and ensures that there are pockets of sacrifice and underdevelopment where diseases fester and then spread globally makes their impact inevitable. The critique proper. We are not science denialists. We can agree warming is real without accepting to the economic pseudoscience that forces other countries to adopt the Western barometer of value in order to receive social benefits and survive the trauma of the climate crisis. The framework debate, don't weigh the affirmative. There's no 1 hour explanation of the benefits of political simulation. You have to defend fiat from the perspective of generating political agency. You've conceded the evidence from Healy that says that the repetition of speech acts that demand demand change in the world is not cause anything but denial and palliatives. The Mutz evidence says that this is a fantasy not grounded in any evidence, which means that all they do is cause a faith in institutions that determines our agency as necessarily passive and not confronting the societal crisis of addiction. The only way to resolve this is to reject the impulse towards hope and stew in the morning of a collective crisis, to generate emotional connections to others and care about violence. That's the Dean evidence and the Mark evidence. The cost-benefit analysis, their evidence says it's bad. It presumes a universal notion of desire, which we have impact termed. There's no impact to fairness explained. You shouldn't allow them to structure the debate about being just mechanisms, because debate over motives determine whether a single plan gets put to a good end or a bad end. That's the Kissinger example. It means we are more educational. They say life first. Precautionary principle relies on a biological conception of life and death that we have criticized. It causes geoengineering because it's so risky. We have to do anything we can, which causes worse problems. Their life first arguments is drop that the death drive is real. Yes, we read the card from psychoanalysis because they do psychological studies, and this means they make value empty and causes fundamentalist violence against those who don't share our conception of universal value. The alternative is not individual transformation, it's collective mourning. Transition towns, Zapatistas idle no more, that are challenging market solutions with blocking capitalist extraction like pipelines, etc. It's the only way to prevent solvency from being co-opted by the addiction to growth.
407.
what stuff are you going to start with?
There will be like a little overview, then the framework stuff, and then the turns case. Thank you.
Gotcha.
No explanation of the alternative with no defense of a theory of psychoanalysis means that it's easy to vote affirmative. All of the negative assumptions rely on a theory of desire that is impossible to falsify, that is too basic, and there's no one part of the brain that makes all of the unconscious decisions for one person, let alone for an entire collective, and it's impossible for psychological theorists or anyone analyst to be able to determine it, which means that there is an infinite number of counterexamples that are able to disprove their theory, especially in the context of all of our studies that prove that there are instances in which cap and trade actually is able to work. There was no warrant for this in the 2NR. The only argument that he made was said that there were psychological studies that were conducted. There was no explanation for this, which means that it's easy for you to default affirmative. Obviously, psychoanalysis professors have an incentive to say that the theory is falsifiable because they're based off of their positions or based off of publishing and saying that this is true, which means that all of their theory is false, but because it's simply too basic and is not able to determine why you should be able to analyze it, but the alternative is not able to solve the death trap. There's no explanation for it, which means that they do not resolve any of the impacts that they isolate, and they're not able to solve warming, which means that they have conceded the precautionary principle for it, that any risk that they're not able to solve the impact of warming means that you should default affirmative because extinction is the largest impact, and we should try to preserve as many lives as possible because that is the most objective framing for the debate, but not that the framing portion of the debate evaluate the plan versus competitive alternative strategy for resolving the impacts of the affirmative. That's best for fairness, otherwise in weeks 9 minutes of the 1AC method, which Tracy has to completely start over. It's infinitely regressive because it's impossible to justify every single desire of every person who went into the writing of the 1AC or every actor describing unfairness as a prerequisite to education because unfairness prevents meaningful discussions from occurring by rigging the game. It's also best for cost-benefit analysis because it's good because it allows for considering the implications that our actions have, which comes from our conception of fiat price for advocacy skills based off of the consideration of how ideas manifest themselves in what potential problems and benefits they could be. It also allows for taking responsibility for our actions, which is ethically valuable for policymaking, which is also a reason why they have to have an alternative because they're not defensible for any of their theories because they just make perfect the enemy of the good. Yes, something possible, perfect, may exist in somewhere, but it is not anything type of reasonable. Now, third is that it's global local framatives, framing class for a combination of science with policymaking and statistics to form an ethics of care where policies can be both persuasive and help people at least more effective policy and communication, which answers their evidence and their much evidence because we should repeat demands in the context of warming, which our evidence indicates that that's the only way to make things visible in the context of global warming. Paris proves that the scientific type of evidence making leads to global connections. Just a question of making action. On top of that, now they need to win. They need to win an alternative in order to debate. It's easy to criticize the system, but it's harder to come up with specific solution. This is uniquely true in the context of climate change because it's a global problem that impacts everything. You should default to the precautionary principle because we are rapidly approaching certain tipping points. We should do that. We should do all that we can to solve the large impact of warming. They don't have any evidence specific to cap and trade. All of our evidence indicates that the necessary to resolve certain tipping points and avoiding like a 2 degrees Celsius rise in climate change, which means that there's no going back. We can't be certain when we get there. There's one sentence about the death drive in the 2NR, but so many concessions about our framing arguments for why life comes first because it's impossible to determine any individual's value to life, but rather that especially in the context of climate change, this is true because it's an unfair moral problem that people do not have an experience with. Now, the affirmative is good for a few specific reasons. First is scientific messaging, which was a little bit explained about which is necessary to lead to a collective solution rather than focusing on the individual because the alternative devolves into people only focusing on the way that they perceive climate change happening to themselves because it focuses on the trauma that they have faced. But if they have not experienced any trauma, then they will not lead to any of them resolving any problems of climate change, whereas science is necessarily more effective because it leads to an understanding of how it affects everyone globally, leads to more form of collective action, which is the only way that's able to resolve things like technology. They do not do enough to actually cut consumption. They do not do anything like closing all factories tomorrow. Rather, the affirmative necessarily employs certain technologies that leads to a gradual transition away from consumption, which is the net more effective way of resolving all of the arguments that they have described as the ramen bro piece of evidence. The second is that we lead to a good utilization of markets. Markets exist and environmental damage is happening now, which means that the only way that you can resolve the impacts is by acting within them. If failure to do so reproduces the different systems of inequality and equity because there are people that do not have access to this type of technology. Now, they are a form of climate denialism because they take a moral high ground and they try to not do anything because they're saying that markets are suddenly bad and it's impossible to act within them, but rather the markets exist, which means that we have to try to act within in the most perfect way possible, which is cap and trade, what it's able to do. Markets are adaptable and they are not able to, it's impossible to say that they're bad in every individual instance. They have not read reasons why cap and trade system is bad in every instance. That was the Bryan and Harvich piece of evidence, the Bryan and Harvich pieces of evidence that we lead to a form of good wealth management and transfer that they don't have any evidence to the contrary that says the affirmative won't lead to any wealth transfers. All of our evidence indicates that there are political and economic incentives that countries have around the world, developed countries like Russia and China and India, but also underdeveloping countries in sub-Saharan Africa and East Southeast Asia that have incentives to work with you, to work with the U.S. and work on linkages, and that's going to happen across the board, and they don't have any evidence the country. It does not lead to forms of surveillance because we're actually cooperating over things like resource and share development and moving away from consumptive patterns, but in a sustainable type of manner. Now, the fetishization of CO2 is necessary in order to solve warming. To say that we cannot fetishize anything is necessarily counterproductive. It leads to a form of climate denialism because they say that they can never tie anything to any impact, but solving warming is necessary because we need to resolve the consumptive patterns that CO2 is able to do. But it's absurd to link us things with like geoengineering because the affirmative is necessary to stop that, because we actually see that there is a collective solution that everyone can take, an individual radical actions like geoengineering are no longer possible. Things like offsets that could potentially be bad. They have no evidence that the affirmative will be able, rather the affirmative evidence indicates that we would be defined in a good, necessarily good way that will allow our sharing of technology. But the alternative is not able to resolve any of these claims, and they have no explanation of it in the 2NR. There's no way to change the mindsets of people or get people to acknowledge their underlying desire. Remember in 2NC Crossing, he couldn't explain why suddenly someone who owns an oil refinery or owns an oil plant is able to change their mind or change their consumptive practices, or even why someone who believes in cap and trade is suddenly going to change their mind about it. And also there's no explanation why voting negative is able to resolve these problems or lead to any type of large-scale shift away from consumptive practices. Going and moving towards a transition town on one individual level is not sufficient enough to resolve the problems that have already occurred. They also have no explanation at what point we stop reveling in the trauma that has already occurred. And for someone that's not reveling in that trauma, it doesn't lead to any impact, but the trauma is already occurring, which means that there's only a risk that doing cap and trade is able to solve some of it.
Congratulations to both teams on a great debate. The decision is a 2-1 for Cal in the negative. I sat out. I thought that the 2AR is correct, that the 2NR doesn't really have a defense of psychoanalytic theory of desire and has barely any explanation of the alternative beyond its collective mourning akin to the Zapatistas. I think that the real problem with the 2NR is just the time allocation. I looked over at Maggie's timer when you got to the line by line. You had spent 4 minutes on the overview, and I just think that kind of caused you to undercover some of the arguments at the bottom of the flow. So I'm unsure how psychoanalytic theory is falsifiable, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of the 1AC's claims can be falsified with specific evidence. I think, Cal, you're winning a lot of this debate on the link level, but I think you're losing on the impact level. But let me talk about framework first. So I'm persuaded by Harvard's argument that it's unfair to deny the fiat. This Mutt's evidence that you talked about in the 2NR about framework being non-falsifiable is kind of unpersuasive to me. I think, Cal, you just need to win an impact turn that a deliberative model of debate is bad because it simply makes us better cogs in an unethical machine, but it seems to be premised on the idea that we can't take any ethical action within a system of neoliberal markets, which that's an argument I simply don't think you're winning. I think maybe neoliberalism is generally unethical, but I think the plan is probably net good for the world. I think some evidence about cap and trade specifically on the case pages would be helpful, maybe some evidence about why actors won't respond rationally to it, or something about how markets will work differently than their evidence is saying would be helpful rather than just evidence about psychoanalysis. As far as the impact level, I think Harvard's winning at extinction is the most unethical thing. It kind of usurps everyone's agency, and there's no coming back from it. I agree with the 2NR that the geoengineering sort of like bad tech impact was definitely dropped in the 1AR, but I don't know how it reaches total extinction. And I'm pretty certain that warming will kill everyone at some point. And as far as like this kind of surveillance interventionism impact, I think the internal link between surveilling developing countries who don't comply with the plan and like intervening on them militarily is not really there. So I just don't think that argument is really complete enough, nor does it get to the extinction level impact that I think they're winning is the most important. Some problems with the alternative, I don't think it solves the app. I think 2NC cross-X is pretty good here for Harvard, although it's a little repetitive, and I think you kind of make your point early on and can move on to other questions. I don't think oil executives will change at all in the world of the alternative. I think there's a big warming DA to the alt. I think the app, Harvard, you could probably better utilize Cal's example of the Zapatistas as their characterization of the alternative. I don't know the exact state of that political struggle, but I imagine it's not going too well. And you can kind of use that better as an example as to why the alternative can't solve the app. I think the plan solves better anyways because it provides a clear incentive to reduce emissions, even if there are instances where actors won't act rationally within the market, which, I just don't think the psychoanalytic theory is there in the 2NR for me to buy into that. I think Cal just needs to better apply those arguments here. So as far as the climate denials and stuff, that's kind of a wash for me. I just end up voting on like warming outweighing and the alternative not being able to solve that.
Cool, I can go. So I end up thinking that there is a sufficient amount of kind of link arguments that reduce the likelihood that I think that the affirmative is able to resolve a lot of the impacts that you're going for. So there are kind of 4 that I'll outline. The first is the Freund evidence, and I think the Dodds evidence that discussed mastery over the environment, I don't think is sufficiently answered. And I don't think that the psychoanalysis stuff answers that, because I think that the way that you all are trying to kind of execute your psychoanalysis stuff isn't specific enough to the way that the negative is kind of explaining it. So it's not psychoanalysis in the sense of I'm going to sit you down on your couch and tell you exactly what you think about the world, but the way that kind of they're talking about and their evidence discusses it is more in context of kind of like a socio-cultural way that we choose to kind of interact with the world around us. And so I think that their Freund and Dodds evidence is pretty good on articulating the way that when we kind of always try to engage in the environment through a rational, calculated, and neoliberal thought process, that environmental destruction is something that becomes inevitable when we continue to engage in that sense. And so that kind of frames the rest of the link arguments that I think are persuasive. So the next is, I don't think that you all have a great answer to this kind of shift argument that they're making about how the carbon market will move. So they have arguments about how we'll continue using the same amount of carbon, right? It'll shift across global markets. Exports, stuff like that, will kind of redefine different limits in ways that mean that the affirmative isn't necessarily able to solve because we'll continue kind of exploiting the environment at the same level. So I think that the ability for you all to kind of access warming against the K is severely mitigated. And then I think that there's the water market turn, where they have this piece of PAR evidence that talks about how that creates kind of dangerous technologies that can hurt people more, and that corporate intervention means that people still won't be able to access water. So I don't think that that impact is, dealt with very well. And the kind of the last one is that I kind of am buying the racial divisions and violence argument about how when we kind of create an international standard where people kind of are pressured in order to change their energy consumption patterns, that means that we're able to kind of exclude people or kind of watch what they're doing and try to force that upon them. So I think that that's at least some sort of external impact. I agree. I think that the alternative needs to be a lot better in the 2NR. But I end up thinking that you have sufficient link mitigation for the affirmative to be able to solve. Their impacts are probably inevitable in my mind. So I think that I should prefer kind of the collective mourning of the alternative. I don't know that that necessarily resolves everything, but I think that it's more likely to if we reject kind of the neoliberal thought processes of the alternative, which is why I voted nay.
I largely agree with Mandy. There are two things. I think is there's a lack of answers to the case turns that I think takes a substantial part of the 1NR and the 2NR. And second, I think the negative is winning a theory of desire. I guess more accurately is at least winning the non-universality of cost-benefit analysis or rational actor theory. So either the affirmative kind of falsely presumes a universal notion of desire, namely that like institutions, individuals respond uniformly to incentives and disincentives, or there's a shift in social values, which seems by kind of 2AR admission to be unlikely. I don't find there to be a substitute response to those who refuse to comport themselves as such within markets or abstain from markets are punished. These kind of examples about the WTO adjustments or sanctions against non-participating states. I'm also not seeing kind of the substantive answers into the arguments about obsession with technology and mastery over the environment, which kind of culminates in ecocide. There's all this like crazy shit about geoengineering, human manipulation that's not answered. And I also think that there's, at the very least, a defense with regards to water, and inability to access, inattentiveness to gender, and the failure of markets due to moving targets, models of technology, and universalization of some finance stuff. I don't think these concerns are outweighed by the precautionary principle approach to climate change, but rather kind of magnifies those concerns. I don't think that's answered either. I think that this means that even if the alternatives kind of dwelling becomes navel gazing, or their mourning becomes melancholy, which is kind of the inability to overcome the lost love object, it's still preferable. And all of these comparisons that they make good the enemy of the perfect, that act is uniquely worse given these case turns. I don't think that they're outweighed by that, because there's questions of solvency as well, because there's not response to these market fails and stuff. I thought that the 2AR was clutch. It was just an answer to a different 2NR.
So do you think that, so just framing the 2AR more around those links and offense about why we don't lead to those types of geoengineering technologies, because don't, or water distribution problems and the fetishization stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What part of the 2AR do you think was redundant or not necessary? Maybe the science stuff, I don't know, or...
Yeah, I think with the science stuff, because, I think you need to have some of that, but I do think you could cut down on some of the science stuff, and I think maybe less of the falsifiability stuff, unless you're going to contextualize that more the way that kind of they're articulating the alternative in that form of psychoanalysis, I think would be a good place to do that.
I agree. Less science stuff. I think the non-falsifiability psychoanalysis, as well as this argument about bias of their authors, could be truncated. The fetishization good argument, I don't know if necessarily is great. It needs to be in the 2AR. Yeah.
And the reason, just so I understand, the reason why psychoanalysis non-falsifiable doesn't apply, can you all just explain it a little more? Because I felt their conception, or like the links were sort of predicated off of like everyone has some desire about consumption or something sort of like that.
So at least the way that I understand it, and I could be wrong about this, but is that the way that they're kind of explaining psychoanalysis in context of the alternative is more contextualized to kind of historical examples and the social climate of the way that we have been continuing to consume despite the fact that we know that environmental destruction is happening. So at least the way that they're explaining the way that kind of our, drive towards destroying the environment happens is based on kind of like falsifiable historical facts, and that type of stuff.
I agree with that. I would also add, I buy the 2NR argument that the act is more deterministic about how people act. It just seems parsimonious for their theory, right? It seems to presume the least about people if they're historically situated, they have some sort of desire. You're the ones who are imposing a kind of universal rational actor theory.
Would some contextualization more about how like markets exist and operate in like historical examples of cap and trade be useful in that discussion sort of, and like helping into that?
I think so.
I think it makes sense to say that people act rationally within markets, even if they don't act rationally outside of those markets, right? We change the way we comport ourselves in different registers. That makes sense to me.
And maybe just more like go hard on just some of the market impact turns that you had earlier in the debate. And I think that just like this is good, this is the necessary way to solve, they're all inevitable, which means that the alt fails. Just like going, hard for all of that stuff, I think is a lot more offensive against the alternative.
For the 1AR, I guess ideally I would have had like more time to be able to answer the specific turns case arguments or the specific link arguments. Where do you think I could make that time?
I think maybe you could just not go to each of the case pages and then extend your impact where you answer those turns.
Okay.
And I think that that's a way to get some more embedded clash on those questions, but maybe like pull out some more warrants from the evidence in the 1AC, or if you have any evidence that you can read on those questions, I think that would be a good way to kind of embed some of that and save some time on the case extension.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I'm not opposed to going to the case pages. I kind of like that about how you just kind of highlight that they're not going there, and that it's kind of specificity argument that's not responded to. But I think you can definitely save some. I agree with Maddie. You can save some time on like the impact level that's done on the criticism. You talk a lot about extinction outweighing coming first. I think that's repeated a couple times, so probably there.
Yeah, that's also something I think is kind of the 2AR. I don't think that the util stuff is the most responsive, when I think that the link arguments they're going for are why those impacts would be inevitable.
I'll be a broken record. I think this festivization of CO2 argument maybe can be truncated. I also think that the alternative does not solve climate change can be truncated, and spend more time on the case turn. Because if you resolve the case term argument and the link arguments, then I have really no qualms with saying, yes, clearly the app solves climate change better than the alternative does.
Yeah,